Welcome to this episode of Dialogues with Creators. This is actually episode number 62 of the program, which started in April of 2022. If you are a new listener, my format is typically to interview an individual who has used their creator-given creativity in some way to make their world better. Sometimes that is through the arts of writing, music, or visual means. Sometimes that is through scholarship or teaching or leadership or entrepreneurship. While most of the episodes have been me interviewing and conversing with one person, occasionally I like to mix things up on this podcast. We have gone on location to the John C. Campbell Folk School in North Carolina, to the Southeastern Quilt and Textile Museum in Carrollton, Georgia, and to the Rabbit Valley Market in Ringgold, Georgia. A few times I have gone solo to share my own work. And sometimes, like today, we have two guests at the same time. Our guests today are two poets, Cynthia Robinson Young of Chattanooga and Rachel Landrum Crumble of also Chattanooga. They are friends and teachers and moms and fulfill many other roles. We will talk about writing, life, and creativity, and mostly poetry. Stay tuned. Cynthia Young and Rachel Crumble, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Barbara. Appreciate you putting us on.
I want to start by letting the listeners get to know you. So we'll start that with Cynthia. Cynthia, can you tell us your story, your early life, how you came to live in the Northwest Georgia and Chattanooga area, and something about your family?
Ooh, that's a lot. Oh, yeah, that is a lot. I'm originally from Newark, New Jersey. I came down to go to college at Covenant College on Lookout Mountain, Georgia. And I met my husband there, and he's from San Francisco, California. So after we got married, I got married end of my junior year. After we got married and graduated, we moved back to the California Bay Area. So I was in California for 30 years, raising my family. And then my husband wanted to come back to Covenant to teach. And so he got his degrees. And in 2004, we returned to the South, and we've been here ever since.
Well, that is really interesting. I did not know that. I knew you were from the Northeast somewhere originally, but not that you'd taken a trek for 30 years out there. Wow. I mean, that is culture shock. Double. Why Covenant? I mean, from New York.
Yeah. The church that I attended, the pastor had a ministry to the inner city and to having an interracial church. And one of the things that he really emphasized was us making sure that we went to a Christian college. And so he had like a little list of colleges that he approved. And one of them was Covenant. And so that's why I found out about Covenant.
All right. Well, it's an excellent college, so it's just a little bit off the beaten path. Oh, yeah. Up on a mountain, but it's beautiful. All right. And do you want to say anything about your family?
I have 8 children, adults now. My youngest is 25. My oldest is 49. He's 50 next month. And then I had 18 grandchildren.
Oh, my word. Are they all around here?
And everybody's here. All 30, I think. Yeah, I think it's 30.
Oh,
madness. Yeah, so all 30 live here in the area.
Did you bring them with you, or did they just migrate back?
I kind of followed. My daughter came out here to work. She also attended Covenant. My first daughter, oldest daughter. And then she got a job at the church that we all had attended, New City Fellowship. And there she met her husband, and he is from Chattanooga. So that's how they ended up here. And we had been sending our kids to Covenant on the airplane. So we said, well, since she's there, why don't we, we're going anyway because we wanted to teach here and we wanted to be with our daughter. And then, as you probably know, California is very expensive. So as our kids, started getting older, they're like, we can't go back to California, even if we want to, because we can't afford to live there. So that's why we ended up here pretty much.
And what does your husband teach? Does he still teach?
We retired, both of us, in 2022, I think. Or 2021.
I thought it was 2022.
Yeah, maybe it's 2022. Who knows? But anyway, he taught early childhood education in the education department.
Oh, how neat. Okay. That's great. I did not know that about you, all that, especially the California thing. That is interesting. So, Rachel, what about you? Take us back.
I also came to the South as a Yankee transplant from Columbia, Maryland. I went to middle school and high school in Columbia, Maryland. I had previously lived for a couple of years in the Philadelphia area, and the first 10 years of my life were in rural Indiana. But I came to attend Covenant College, and I loved the rigor and the emphasis on Christ being the Lord of all of culture. That was a lovely thing. But I felt like a hothouse flower, like I needed to work out the good stuff I'd already learned within the 2 years I was there. And I was eager to do that and to take more writing classes. So I transferred to UTC because I wanted to stay. I wanted to continue to be involved in my church, which was New City Fellowship, because it was doing that thing of working out culture in terms of being a cross-cultural church intentionally and ministering to the core and doing the word. And so I wanted to stay with that. I met my husband through friends at church, and so we've stayed ever since then.
So that's interesting. You're from Columbia. I'm from Prince George's County.
Okay.
I grew up there in the Bladensburg, Hyattsville area. Okay. Yeah, I went to Bladensburg High School, which it exists, but not in the same place now. But that was a really long time ago. So, which county is Columbia in?
It's in Howard County.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, my brother still lives in Anne Arundel County, so I go up about once a year to see him. So, yay. Okay, interesting. Very cool. And what about your children?
I have 3 children. The youngest is 26. Then 30, almost 35 will be next week. And then 37, the oldest, my only daughter is 37. And she moved back here before she had her twins. And she was gone for quite a long time, from the time she was 18, pursuing acting in California, and ended up in various points. So I'm thankful that she's back here. But my middle son is in New York, and the younger one lives around here.
Okay. So you remained here once you came to school here?
I did.
So both of you have been teachers at Covenant, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was adjunct at Covenant.
Okay. So, and you both teach English?
Taught English and creative writing, and so does
I taught. 15 years. It was only I was in the education department teaching education for how to teach special education for educators.
Okay,
so that was trying to help. It was at a time when inclusion wasn't a normal thing in Christian schools, especially. And in the public schools, pretty much they were separated as well. And so I was I renamed my course privately called the Theology of Special Education, meaning that, and try to teach them that, it has to begin in your heart. And then if you really believe that these children should be, with their peers, then you can figure out how to make it work instead of, well, I don't think it's going to work, so they can't come in, So, which is what basically that's what everyone thought in 2004.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Wow. So, thank you for sharing that. And, both of you are published poets. And I have to say that I admire poets so much because although I write a lot, I produce a lot of words and I spend a good bit of my daily time writing something, either something for work or some nonfiction or fiction. It's very, very, very rarely any poetry. Maybe once a year, I might produce something that is vaguely poetic or vaguely in some sort of poetic form. And I almost think, and you may disagree with me, so we can talk about that, but that it is a whole different way of thinking about expression and seeing the world as a writer. So I want to ask you, Rachel, I'll start with you. Why poetry? What drew you to it? And when did you start creating poetry seriously? And then when did you start seeking publication, as it were?
Okay. I started writing poetry from the context of a loving but dysfunctional family. My mom was schizophrenic. I was the youngest of 6 kids.
Oh my.
So yeah, from the time I was about 1.5 until I was 3, my mom was hospitalized. And people in that rural community took us in. And that was amazing because they didn't know us. Like we had just moved there and we were strangers. But anyway, there was so much I could not, just like that don't talk rule in dysfunctional families. There's so much I could not say out loud that writing poetry specifically, it was a kind of encoded speech where I felt like I was yelling what was my truth, but it was still encoded. I had to learn how to make it intelligible to other people because I loved imagery and metaphor and stuff like that. So that was what drew me to poetry, was a place where I could express myself uncensored. I published a few things when I was an undergraduate at UTC, because one of my professors had a magazine and he took some of my stuff, and it was, when I look at that thing now, I'm like, oh my gosh, there were so many like rising, really good writers that were in that. And that community was a great community for hearing lots of really, really good poets. And then when I was in an MFA program, low residency, Vermont College, because I had just gotten married and I didn't want to uproot. But it also appealed to me to stay in and work things out creatively in my own community and be able to go and, every 6 months and convene with people, get a belly full of all that and go home and work it out again. So it was good for me. But during that time, I published when I had kids and I was working. I kept writing, but I didn't pursue publication that much, which is why it took me till 2022 to publish my first poetry book, even though I sent it out a whole bunch. I don't even want to think about how many times I sent it out, but it was published in 2022. And that the work in the book It's called Sister Sorrow, and it spans about 37 years. I looked like that doesn't mean that everything I wrote in that time is in that book by any means. I have a couple more books in line, but yeah.
Okay. Was it Richard Jackson who was the teacher? Yes. He's a legend. A lot of people know him. Yes, I was going to ask you. So you felt that the poetry allowed you to express of what you were feeling?
Yes.
Yeah. So you didn't just write it out like Dear Diary kind of stuff. It was more like a poem.
Well, I did. I mean, not early on. I didn't. Early on, it was kind of like I was writing songs or something that were referring to things that my psyche knew about, but my conscious mind didn't. And then later, and I've journaled all my life too. But it was like through the lens of poetry that I really could encapsulate experience and felt safe communicating experience at first. Yeah.
And it's interesting that I imagine, because I've taken fiction writing courses, I imagine that in your workshops, in your MFA program, you would sit there and you would critique each other's poems and do that kind of thing. And to be honest, while I can read a poem and give people thoughts and ideas, the idea of really critiquing it from that level and that depth and of the technical part of it, because there's so many genres of poetry or forms, and there's so many just really nuanced kinds of things. I would love to sit in on one. I would get a lot out of it, but I wouldn't know where to open my mouth. It would just be a really deep learning experience. So,
I have a very intuitive grasp of all that. Like I can't always call to my mind, oh, this is a blah, 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 blah. And so that's why you should do blah, blah, blah. It's more just like my writing is more intuitive. I've internalized all that knowledge, and sometimes I can be impressive and pull it off a shelf and say what it is. But sometimes I could just, I can point out what the thing is without giving it the technical name,
So Cynthia, obviously you are an accomplished and published poet too. So did you start with poetry or fiction or nonfiction? What was it, poetry first, and what drew you to it and your public experience as a poet?
Right. I started, like Rachel, journaling and everything. I always wanted to write fiction. That was always my goal. I wasn't successful at it. But that was always the plan. I was never planning on being a poet. And then I think at Covenant, I did take a class in poetry, and the teacher did not like my poetry. So I'm like, okay. I think that, unlike Rachel, who has a grasp of poetry, I don't know if I ever really understood what I was doing, and what, how to really understand poetry, how to teach it. I just knew that I started reading Black authors, Black poets, and they really resonated with me because they were kind of telling the Black experience in a different form, and I was really attracted to that. And so I tried my hand at it again. And because 1975, when I moved back before I had moved to California, I was really wanting to write poetry, but it wasn't, everyone said, no, you really should not do it. It's not very good. And then when I got to California, I joined a writing group, and they said, actually, you write poetry. And that's where I first got published. So in 1975, I had my first poem published. And it got like a lot of traction. It got anthologized. And then I wrote another poem and that got a lot of traction. So then I said, oh, maybe I could be a poet. So, because now I'm getting affirmation with that. So yeah, that's the kind of the door that I went into.
Yeah, I'm a little, I kind of want to take a detour here about teachers. Is it your teacher didn't like it? I mean, did she actually say, I don't like this? Or
well, my friend, yeah, I had my roommate was taking the class with me. She never wants to be a writer. She basically copied songs from the radio. Like I knew these terms, you know, like the quiet storm. That was the,
Oh my gosh.
and the teacher loved it. So she got an A and like barely, I mean, I almost had to beg her to give me a B, but yeah, she didn't like it. So.
well, it's a good thing you tried it again. In California, imagine they were a little more open-minded too in California, maybe, or it gave you some avenues that maybe you couldn't have found here. I don't know. That's just
Right. Also, I think there's a whole cultural divide in poetry between Western's
traditional.
European sensibility of what a poem is, haiku-like, imagistic, spare words, versus African-American poetry, which is more conversational and finding that moment in time and capturing that in a way that's eloquent, but not necessarily imagistic or spare.
Okay. Yeah. No, thank you. I think that says a lot. Yeah. But what I was thinking is that, you know, I hope as a teacher, and I probably did because I've taught for so long, I hope I never gave anybody the impression that they just couldn't do it, you know, I'm afraid I probably have, but that's probably why I don't teach creative writing. Look, well, I don't really want to read 18-year-olds' work. And then I said, well, maybe I would not be the best person to read these kinds of things, you know, because your tastes are your tastes, and sometimes they take over. I mean, it's like in a writer's group, like we're in, you know, you don't necessarily like what everybody's writing, you know, it's not your cup of tea, but you're in the group, so you have this commitment, you know, to do what your job is. So that's interesting. So in both cases, Cynthia, what was the name of your first poem that was published, the title of it?
It was called The Rainbow Child. It was before rainbow meant anything except what I wanted it to mean.
Yes.
And it was a story, and I call it a story because I realized that I probably, if I had to pick a category, then I'm probably a narrative poet. And so it was a story basically about looking at my son and seeing, so I'm interracially married and my husband had red hair and, you know, so he's got the, you know, white skin that burns and everything. And then here comes, and then I'm me. And then my son comes out and, I was wondering, how did my husband feel to have his son be with him and not resemble him in any way? And just realizing that so the poem is about the strengths that both of us bring to our son.
Oh.
So.
And Rachel, what was your first one entitled?
My first one that I had published.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what
Goodness. Wow. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think one of them was called Celebrating the Birthdays of the Dead. You know, it sounds like an 18-year-old poem, doesn't it? But anyway, yeah, it was about my grandmother. It wasn't about ghoulish things.
Yeah.
It's just about thinking about, well, what does it mean now? to
Right.
come to her birthday when she's gone. No. Anyway.
And so, Cynthia, what are your collections of poetry entitled? Your collections?
So the first one is Migration, and the second one is called Reflections of a Feral Mother.
Okay. All right. Are they very different? I think I have Migration. I've been reading it. So are they very different?
Yeah, Migration is more, it's a story of basically the migration of my family starting in Africa and going through the South and then the migration up to the North and then my migration back to the South. So, yeah. And then Reflections of a Feral Mother is just a collection of poems about things that I think about as a mother raising, especially Black sons in a racialized world.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we're going to kind of segue into a different part of this podcast. And so one thing I've learned about poetry is that it's one thing to talk about it in the abstract and another to just read or experience it. So now I would like you both to read some of your poems. I have left these selections up to you, and also any comments you want to make about them, the background, etc. And I have been reading from your recent published collections, and I want to say it's kind of like the famous Emily Dickinson line in her letter to Thomas Higginson. I had to look it up because I knew that she wrote this, but I had to find the context. And she said, "If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way?" Okay. A little dramatic on Emily's part. She's talking about the very physical and visceral, perhaps, and emotional responses to poetry. And I felt those with yours. So I'm going to ask Cynthia to go first, and we'll talk about them, and then we'll hear from Rachel. So take it away, Cynthia.
Do you care whether the poems come from the books or do you?
Oh, no, not at all. Whatever you choose to read is fine.
I'm going to go on and read from Migration. The story I want to read is the poem about my father, and it's called My Father on His Deathbed. And I wrote this. I remember being in the kitchen, and they were talking about people dying and, being on their deathbed. And it just occurred to me, like, wait. So I was trying to imagine my father on his deathbed. And I realized I never saw that because he didn't have one, because they found him in an alley. And, and that's where he was. And so next time I saw him, he was, at a funeral home. So that's how this story came about. My father on his deathbed, except he didn't have one. His deathbed was an alley street, far away from comfort. He was abandoned, lonely, confused, staring at a needle he had anchored into his arm, not meaning to draw his life out, staring into streetlights until they became stars. He wondered what will happen next in a world he believed he created with his family, and now believes the drugs have destroyed. I, on my twin bed, across from my sister, hear the doorbell ring at 4 a.m. See it is still dark as the night before. Recognize even then the sound of the insistent knock of death's messenger. My mother, in her empty marital bed, reaches out to no one, then awakens to grief as an expectancy of this visit. These policemen, this news, this ending that was always on its way to our doorstep.
Mm-hmm. Very gripping.
The second poem I think I'll read comes from, so I have a collection that I've worked on and I've sent out and it's come back. Or I've sent it out again and it's come back. But it's called She Named Me After the Moon. It's been it has been accepted, but they wanted to have it published as a chapbook, and I didn't want that. So that's why I'm continuing to look for a home for it. But the epigraph for it comes from Alice Walker. And she says, so it's a whole book about honoring my ancestral mothers. So my great-great-grandmother, starting with the mother who came from Africa all the way to my mother, and then it ends with me, because she named me after the moon. But Alice Walker says, how simple a thing it is, it seems to me, that to know ourselves as we are, we must know our mother's names. Oh. Well, that was the emphasis for this collection. And so my grandmother's name is Theosa. And I didn't know that was her name until I started working on migration, and I couldn't find her. And then my uncle, thank goodness he was still alive, said, oh no, her name's not Teresa, it's Theosa. And that's why you can't find her. You know, I'm like, oh my gosh. So that's what this poem's about. Her name was Theosa. In the family Bible, I discovered my grandmother's real name before she had to change it, not to be more American, but to be less of a Southerner. Back when those who had just arrived from Georgia were looked down upon, red clay dirt still under their fingernails, eyes still searching for greenery over this gray concrete and black asphalt. Theosa is a beautiful name, but the school kids acted like the melody was caught in their throats like fried catfish bones. So she changed it to a northern name that they could embrace more and bully less. Now all that was left was her longing for what her parents were glad to leave behind. Dense woods and forests where no one never ever knew who they'd run into hanging from a poplar tree.
Mm.
And do you want another one?
Oh, yes, please.
Okay. So this is from Reflections of a Furrow Mother. And again, it's another story, because I realize I just tell stories. And this was a story of the first time that there are some collective things that experiences that most or not all African Americans have. And one of them is the first time someone called them the N-word. So this is called The First Time. Two events I always confuse as if they happened on the same day when I was 5 years old, living in a house we had moved away from when I was 4. A little white girl I called my friend, a playground swing set in her backyard. My little playmate, come out and play with me, and bring your dollies 3, climb up my apple tree. I played whatever she wanted, but the one time I didn't, she called me the N-word and dismissed me, pointed me back to my house next door. I remember sadness sitting in my mother's kitchen, covering the sun with troubled clouds when I asked her what that word meant. Then there's a second event. Me on the same afternoon, back on the neighbor's swing, flying high, as if no mean words were ever said, My dress is white like the clouds like cotton candy, the sky a blues baby in which I soar, my brown legs pumping high in the air. But my dress is now stained red, bleeding from a word made into a weapon to pierce my spirit, a violent slaughter, a premonition of all the future times I will forget to remember to guard my heart.
Oh, thank you. I'm not going to insult you by giving any commentary. I'm much more interested in because they're very moving. Thank you for sharing those. How do you feel now about, again, I'm inarticulate here. I'm so interested in how poets think and operate and how they do what they do. How do you feel about those poems now?
How do I feel about them? I'm always surprised. Every time I read, I'm like, oh, I wrote that, Cool. It really, I think I must have done a good job because that captures what I was feeling, that experience. So, so that's when I realized I'm a narrative poet, because I write about experiences. And I have been accused of, not enough images, not enough abstract images. It's too prosaic. But I realize it's the way I write. So, okay, love that.
It's just a different aesthetic because it's a different experience.
I'm going to come to fiction in a little bit, but let's hear from Rachel now. And
it was hard to choose, but I chose two from Sister Sorrow and then two other ones. So this first one was anthologized in a book, Reflections on Heaven, Images of Glory. And it was just really funny because it was this, like, C.S. Lewis is in this thing, all these people who are, Chesterton was, and it was just funny. It was like being in heaven already to be in this anthology with these people. But anyway, this is called Here and Now. And in terms of sort of sensibility, there's a story within it, but this is much more, a lot of times I'm much more imagistic, sort of philosophical. And this would be one of those, but hopefully visual so that you're not lost. There and Now. And it's called, the there is heaven. The now is here on earth. Beauty finds new voice there. Not this heartbreaking elegy of ululating song. Here, where late summer leaves turn dead green. There, the painter dabs a touch of yellow so that spring becomes a way of life. There, too, regret turns like an arrow in mid-flight, becomes joy, exploding brilliant as fireworks in the never-ending day. Here, imperfection marks the trail to beauty, just as sin, a night sky, shows the brilliance of grace, a full moon. There, that moon is but one in a galaxy of bright planets, the first letter in a mysterious alphabet whose lexicons cannot exhaust words of praise. I prayed with my mother on the phone days before her death. Later, in a dream, we prattled like school chums on the alpine peaks of heaven, her now violet eyes washed of their green envy. The prayers of my ancestors echo peace to me across the canyon of eternity. When I am destitute of history, of hope, I have only to lay down my head and listen.
So that was in a book of other Christian poems?
Yeah, it was that were about heaven.
Okay.
I had a friend who worked for a Great Commission and was asked to edit a book for Lucy Shaw, publisher. Yeah, right. So, this one is called An Apologetic of Flight, and it sort of more tells a story, but it's very much my story of experience of childhood. An apologetic of flight, a defiance of gravity, bit in the eye of physical probability, a Six Flags for the soul, a way to match flesh and spirit, step for wing, finite with infinite. As a child, flying was a dormant power, unleashed only in sleep, and sleep was an escape from the world of impossible gravity, and gravity was an inscrutable calculus to solve without so much as the wooden abacus locked in my father's study. There were boundaries I was made to break through, but in my waking life, I was afraid of heights, and the door closed against the darkness of my mother's bedroom, and the witch when she rose up in the body of the fairy godmother. That's why I have been training since childhood for flight, as if my spirit flew before I grew roots, was earthbound before being knit together in my mother's womb or anchored to her pain. In my dreams, I had only to bend my elbows to rocket straight up or hover a foot off the ground, a helium-filled balloon on a string wrapped around God's finger. I will be recalled someday. On windy days, the reflected light is blinding. Meanwhile, since each day's cloudscape is ravishing and singular, I want to rush to be one with all that I praise, to fathom the membrane between me and the world.
You use a lot of words that we know what they mean, but you use them in ways, I don't know, I don't want to say creative, just so uniquely. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I don't say too much.
Okay. This one is the title poem from my next collection of poems that I'm getting ready to send out. If I could just get the table of contents finished. It's called In Praise of Detours, and it was published in the Porterhouse Review. In Praise of Detours. At the starting line of my white suburban guilt, I first foresaw a tweedy liberal blue blood in my future, a family friend. Then, God forbid, a disheveled manic angel. I was on my way to an addiction to unstable men who would disappoint me, fair-haired, blue-eyed progeny, a divorce. But traffic was heavy. I was impatient and took a detour. You were on your way to winning a black trophy wife to please your father, who always disappointed you. You were this quirky drummer with this blowout fro, a laugh and a stutter. You never wanted to date a white woman again, and I didn't care. I thought you were sent on some mission of rescue by a mutual friend. Not sure what you saw, but you couldn't leave me alone. You called me from the phone in my dorm lobby and took your time asking me out. 35 years later, our 3 children, have your heart-shaped face and my smile conceived in the laughter we share. Tonight, I arrive here, knowing I have loved you more than half my life, and that more than this house, you are my home. And if I have time, I can read one more or I can stop. Because it's...
No, I wanted to talk a little bit more, if you don't mind. What I want to say is those who are listening need to get their books. And so one is Sister Sorrow by Rachel Crumble, and the other is Migration. And the one about the name, the Feral Mother.
Reflections of a
Feral Mother by Cynthia Robinson Young. I'm sorry. One thing I always want to ask poets is, how do you know when the poem is done?
I don't know. I know some people. I have a friend who's written like 7 books, and like she is obsessive about revision. Like she would keep revising. And I guess, I mean, I need input, and we have been in a poetry group for years with, Helga Kidder and KB. And,
okay.
That has been a very helpful group. Very helpful to have other eyes on it. So beyond getting that input from other people about just what lands or what doesn't land, right? In terms of being confused, even if maybe they take it differently than you wrote it, if it's like still works, it's like, well, yeah, that's metaphor. You can see it in all kinds of ways. But I don't know, when I feel like it encapsulates an experience and I don't know what else to say. It's like, yeah, I don't know.
Yes, I agree with Rachel. I mean, when I write my poems, they all come out, it comes out at once. So I'm already like, part 1 is done. I'm not going to probably be adding more. I'm going to be trying to improve the words in it, or making it more clear what I was trying to say. But once I feel like I've said what I meant to say, I've gotten when I've gotten rejections, they'll say, I don't feel like this poem is finished. And I'm like, well, it's finished for me. I'll just have to find another home for it. So, and that's happened. I found another home. People realize it. Yeah, she's done. No.
It's interesting you mentioned KB, because she was one of my first interviews on this podcast. And still to date, she is her podcast is the most listened to. I have close to 700 listens on hers. And I think because she put it on her website, but I just, and because it's her, but yeah, she's my most popular one so far. And then the second question I wanted to ask was, when you say you send out your books, who do you send your books of poems to? And what's that like?
The process of trying to get published, books published? Oh, boy.
What's hell? That's a big question. I mean, I've been sending out, with Migration, I only sent it out twice.
Oh.
Reflections was longer. It was a full collection. I cut it down to a chapbook. And then when it got published, it was by a publisher who only wanted like 12 poems. And so I had to go back and just look at the meat of what I really wanted to say with this title and, what the goal was. But with the book that I'm trying to find a home for now, it's been really expensive because I'm trying to find poems. I mean, the homes publishers that I might understand what I'm trying to say, and, the people that, and I also do contests because someone recommended that contests were the way to go. But they're very expensive.
They're not.
Yeah, you don't get to, I love Patricia Smith. If she's going to be a judge, I want her to tell me that she doesn't like it. Not all the readers that come before who don't understand what I'm trying to say.
Right.
So it's just,
I don't do contest for my short stories anymore.
Yeah.
Unless it's really minimal, like $5 or $10, I might do it. But 20, it just gets to be too expensive. You feel like you're paying somebody else to do their job. So what I wanted to move on to next is what you're, as you've already mentioned, what you're working on now. And so the reason I know Cynthia and Rachel is that they are members of the same writers group I am affiliated with in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, which is a different one than the one they previously mentioned. In all honesty, personally, I have been missing in action for quite a while because of my job just really not allowing me much freedom. However, I read the submissions every 2 weeks and occasionally submit something myself, but not as much as Rachel and Cynthia do. I have interviewed a couple of other members in the group, and our group tends to be a novel writing group. And so Cynthia and Rachel are both working on novels. So my question as a person who writes fiction and not really poetry is, how do you two see this transition from poetry to fiction? Is it challenging? Is it fun? Is it just different? Is it?
I started doing it because it was fun, because I was totally gassed after Sister Sorrow came out during the pandemic and wasn't a very successful launch of a book. Even though I totally believe in the book. But there are things I could have done differently. There were things I couldn't have done differently because it was still the pandemic.
Yeah.
And so I actually despaired of writing, but so I started writing fiction to gain back my joy of writing. Just do something different and let myself play and not, just not worry about the business end of it for a while, even though that's going to come to me worrying about it again if it's a successful book. And I've got 25 chapters now. But anyway, I've just been having a good time playing, honestly. I mean, I do go back and revise according to all of your comments, and you are so amazing to still read our work and give us comments. That is just awesome. But
we enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they're interesting. So I want to see what's going to happen. I have 25 chapters. I'm invested in these people.
Right.
What happened? So what about yours, Cynthia? The trans.
Yeah. I grew up loving fairy tales. I've read, every fairy tale when I was younger. I just love it. And so my novel started off as what would happen based on, the poem, My Father on His Deathbed.
Mm-hmm.
What if he didn't have a deathbed because he woke up again and he wasn't really dead? And I think a lot of children, especially, think about, what if, my parents hadn't died? What would that look like? So that's how the book got started. So it was always fantastical. So to me, the transition from poetry into fiction wasn't that hard. I also love Toni Morrison. I feel like she writes really poetically. She's my idol mentor. And so I was trying to embody her style as I wrote my novel.
Yes, I can see that because yours has a kind of a magical realism. Is the thing about it, but I'm fascinated with the whole idea of a town in Georgia that sort of protected where the Black people can live after, in this Jim Crow bad era, but they're kind of protected in they're not always seen, they're kind of invisible in a way. I think it's fascinating. I think it's really neat. And so I can see that. Okay. And is there anything about writing fiction that you find more frustrating, or is it just fun?
I've been playing up until chapter 25, and now I've got stage fright. It's not like I don't have ideas about what to do next. It's like, how do I get there? And how far ahead can I jump, or how much can I just turn the narrative? Of course, I see novels doing that all the time, but so suddenly, I still haven't finished what I need to get in by Saturday, and I've been working on it, but today I've been avoiding work.
Yeah. And I'm, this is my 6th or 7th draft. So I'm like, so right now I'm working on something else because I can't stand the thought of having to do any more revisions on that right now. So hopefully my next step will be either finding an agent or, something where, we're really at the home stretch and we're not like, why don't you rewrite this all over again? No.
Yeah.
Well, on this episode, we've been talking with Rachel Landrum Crumble and Cynthia Robinson Young, poets and writers, and ladies with lots of other roles, and children and teaching and other things, I'm sure, and lots of life experiences that they bring to their poetry and their fiction writing. Anything else that you would like to add to our discussion, ladies?
I would like to add my website. It is just CynthiaRobinsonYoung.com.
Okay, that's simple. That's how mine is. Just my name. Well, you want to own your name. It's your domain. So,
yeah.
Yep.
Oh, I need to own my name then, because mine is poetteachermom.com. Poetteachermom.com. Right.
Okay. Anything else?
Just thank you so much for having us on.
It's been great. I have enjoyed this a lot. And thank you both so much for your time this evening. And I hope you have a great night.
Okay. You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
The question I asked myself almost every day is, how much longer will I podcast? In reality, I love doing this, but there are some downsides. So I need your help. Share these episodes on social media. Go back and listen to older ones. And write me through my website about who you would like to hear on this podcast. That will all really help. And as it is the Christmas season, where we buy gifts for each other, I hope you will consider purchasing gifts that are locally made from local businesses and from local artists and writers. Thank you for listening, and many thanks, as usual, to our producer, Clemencia Villafuerte. Goodbye.